On April 13th, 2026, the President of the United States went on Truth Social, his preferred venue for geopolitical announcements, and posted the following. Not a briefing, not a formal address, a post. Quote, warning, if any of these ships come anywhere close to our blockade, they will be immediately eliminated. Eliminated, all caps, on a social media platform. Directed at the shipping traffic of a sovereign nation the United States was simultaneously in ceasefire talks with. Let that sit for a second. The U.S. military had just imposed a full naval blockade on Iranian ports. 10,000 American personnel, more than a dozen warships, dozens of aircraft, all deployed to choke off a country the size of Alaska at one of the most critical choke points on Earth. And the official communication of this act, this extraordinary, historically serious use of naval force, arrived between someone's breakfast recap and a Truth Social ad for gold-plated Bible covers. Dude, that's actually the president. This is what American power looks like in 2026. And this is what happened, and why it happened, and what it tells us about a country that has stopped being surprised by anything, but hasn't quite figured out whether that's wisdom or catastrophe. The story begins, as so many stories in this era do, with a decision made faster than anyone fully thought through. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched coordinated surprise airstrikes on Iran. The strikes targeted military installations and government sites. They also assassinated Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. In response, Iran did the one thing it has always held in reserve as its ultimate economic leverage. It closed the Strait of Hormuz. The strait is 21 miles wide, at its narrowest point. Through those 21 miles pass approximately 20% of the world's seaborne oil and 20% of its liquefied natural gas. Every barrel of crude from Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Iraq, and Qatar that heads east or west passes through that bottleneck. It is, in the language of energy analysts, irreplaceable. There is no plan B, and Iran closed it. Oil prices immediately went vertical. The U.S. military began a campaign to reopen the strait in mid-March. It destroyed 16 Iranian mine layers. Trump, on March 9th, announced that the war was very complete, pretty much, and that the Iranian military had been destroyed. Then, Iran started charging passing ships tolls of up to $2 million per vessel. Trump called this world extortion. Both of these things were typed in all capitals. A temporary 2-week ceasefire was reached on April 8th. The deal was supposed to include the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz. Iran partially reopened it, then started controlling traffic again, allowing ships from China, Russia, India, and a handful of other favored nations to pass while blocking others. This is when the toll system kicked in at full scale. Here is the detail that most coverage buried. Iran wasn't just blocking oil, it was selectively reopening it, creating a geopolitical leverage system in real time. Countries that defied U.S. pressure were being rewarded with passage. Countries that aligned with Washington were being squeezed. The Strait of Hormuz had become effectively a geopolitical auction house. Iran was playing a game the U.S. had invented sanctions as leverage, and playing it with 20% of the world's oil supply as the chips. On April 12th, J.D. Vance flew to Islamabad for the first face-to-face U.S.-Iran negotiations since 2015. He spent 21 hours on the ground. He left without a deal. Iran would not commit to fully abandoning its nuclear program. The U.S. would not commit to lifting sanctions. Both sides announced the talks had been constructive. That is diplomat speak for nothing happened. The morning after Vance left Islamabad, Trump announced the blockade. As of April 13th, the U.S. Navy would intercept every vessel entering or leaving Iranian ports. Over the following week, 23 ships were turned back. On April 19th, Marines from the 31st Expeditionary Unit seized the Iranian-flagged cargo vessel Tauska in the Gulf of Oman. By April 22nd, Trump posted on Truth Social that the blockade was costing Iran $500 million a day, and then, in the same post, characterized the Iranian leadership as starving for cash and in SOS mode. He used the actual SOS abbreviation. In a geopolitical dispatch about a naval blockade, on April 22nd, Iran seized 2 commercial ships of its own in the Strait of Hormuz. The ceasefire, technically, was still in effect. Here is the thing about the Iran blockade that makes it genuinely, historically remarkable and not in the way the White House would prefer. In 2018, Trump withdrew the United States from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal. The deal that, whatever its limitations, had Iran's uranium enrichment under international inspection and its stockpiles capped. Trump called it the worst deal ever made. He reimposed sanctions. He launched what he called maximum pressure. The goal was to force Iran back to the table and negotiate a better deal, one that would address not just the nuclear program, but Iran's ballistic missiles and its support for regional proxy groups. 8 years later, Trump is back in the White House. Iran has no nuclear deal. Its uranium stockpiles have grown exponentially. It has developed the very ballistic missile systems the original pressure campaign was supposed to prevent. And the United States is now engaged in an active armed conflict with Iran, a conflict that has closed the world's most important oil choke point, sent crude prices above $100 a barrel, and placed 20% of global energy supply in the hands of a country whose supreme leader was killed by an American airstrike. The maximum pressure campaign applied across 2 administrations, through sanctions, assassinations, and proxy conflicts produced, as its endpoint, a war. This is not a partisan observation. This is a factual one. The policy, pursued with variations in intensity but consistent in direction, did not prevent the outcome it was designed to prevent. It accelerated it. Iran, facing economic strangulation with no off-ramp, made the calculation that the only leverage it had left was the one thing sanctions couldn't touch: geography. The Strait of Hormuz has always been Iran's nuclear option, not the bomb, the bottleneck. And now the United States is running a naval blockade to counter an adversary whose most powerful weapon is the 21 miles of water it sits next to. Trump's response to Iran closing the strait was to close the strait more, but only to Iran. The logic being, we will blockade you until you agree to stop blockading others, a counter-blockade. The geopolitical equivalent of responding to a traffic jam by adding another car? There is also the small matter of China. Iran had been selling oil to China throughout the entire maximum pressure campaign through shell companies, shadow fleets, and intermediaries that the U.S. sanctioned with metronomic regularity. By April 20th, Lloyd's List reported that at least 26 ships had bypassed the U.S. blockade entirely, sailing in both directions into and out of Iranian ports without being interdicted. The blockade that Trump described as a finely tuned machine had a leak rate in its first week of more than 1 ship per day. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent announced that Karg Island, Iran's main oil export terminal, would be full in a matter of days, and Iran's fragile oil wells would be forced to shut down. This was probably true. It was also a statement made while 26 ships had already bypassed the blockade, and while China had not agreed to honor it, and while France and the UK were organizing a separate peaceful multinational mission explicitly designed to restore shipping that did not involve the United States. This is the plan. This is the plan. The White House press secretary, Caroline Leavitt, described Iran's seizure of 2 commercial ships as evidence that Iran had gone from the most lethal navy in the Middle East to now acting like a bunch of pirates. She said this while U.S. Marines had, 4 days earlier, boarded and seized an Iranian-flagged cargo vessel in international waters. The irony was not addressed. Trump's own side responded the way Trump's own side always responds, with absolute, unqualified confidence that everything is going exactly to plan. Bessent called the blockade incredibly effective and said it was targeting Iran's primary revenue lifelines. Leavitt said the president was happy with the economic pressure. Fox News ran graphics of U.S. warships with the Chiron. America strikes back. Republican senators issued statements of support, several of them calling for even stronger measures, because the correct response to a blockade that isn't fully working is to announce a bigger blockade with more conviction. Nobody in Trump's coalition publicly noted that 26 ships had bypassed the blockade in its first week. Nobody in Trump's coalition asked what the endgame was. The press secretary clarified that Trump has not set a deadline himself for when Iran needs to respond. This means the blockade is indefinite. The ceasefire is also extended indefinitely. The war is paused indefinitely. Everything is on hold indefinitely, while a $100 barrel of oil slowly roasts the economies of every allied nation that imports energy. The opposition responded with the predictable combination of outrage and uselessness. Democrats issued statements calling the blockade reckless, pointing out that it wasn't authorized by Congress, noting that a $100 barrel of oil hits working-class families hardest. All of this was accurate. None of it was accompanied by any concrete legislative action, because congressional action on war powers is something the United States has not meaningfully attempted since approximately 1973. The War Powers Act exists. It functions primarily as a document people cite in press releases. The rest of the world responded with a clarity that is almost refreshing in its unanimity. China condemned the blockade as irresponsible and dangerous, and said it went against the international community's interests. China did not honor the blockade. China's ships continued to transit to and from Iranian ports because China imports enormous quantities of Iranian oil and has exactly zero legal obligation to respect a unilateral U.S. naval blockade applied in international waters without a UN Security Council resolution, which the U.S. had not sought, presumably because China would have vetoed it. The UK declined to join the blockade. Prime Minister Keir Starmer said Britain's focus was keeping the waterway open, noting that British citizens were paying for this war in their energy bills. France and Britain announced they would co-organize an international conference on a peaceful multinational mission for freedom of navigation. This is the diplomatic equivalent of America's closest allies saying, "We're doing our own thing." Ordinary people, in the meantime, were paying $100 for a barrel of oil. Brent crude, the global benchmark, was running 50% above where it had been a year ago. Rystad Energy projected it would take until July for oil flows through the strait to reach 90% of pre-war levels. Another 2 months after that for processed fuel to reach global refineries. The people paying for the geopolitics of the Hormuz Strait were not the people arguing about it on Truth Social. They were the people filling up their cars, paying their heating bills, buying groceries that arrived on diesel trucks. Iran's President Masoud Pezeshkian, in a statement from Tehran, said his country welcomed dialogue, but that breach of commitments, blockade, and threats are the main obstacles to genuine negotiations. This is a sentence that would look perfectly reasonable coming from either side of this conflict, which is either a mark of diplomatic symmetry or a sign that both sides are performing the same script with different costumes. Let's be honest about what this moment reveals, because the blockade itself is not the story. The blockade is a symptom. The United States has, for 47 years, since the Iranian Revolution of 1979, attempted to manage an adversarial relationship with Iran primarily through economic punishment, sanctions, embargoes, asset freezes, secondary sanctions, threatening any country that trades with Iran. The theory was always the same. Squeeze hard enough, and the regime will either change its behavior or collapse under its own contradictions. The regime did not collapse. The regime adapted. It built a shadow oil fleet. It developed alternate financial networks. It deepened ties with China and Russia. It ran its nuclear program underground, literally burrowing centrifuge halls into mountains. And it calculated correctly that if it was going to be treated as a pariah regardless of what it did, it might as well maximize its leverage rather than minimize its defiance. This is not a defense of the Iranian government. The same government that is currently in ceasefire negotiations executed 1,639 people in 2025, a 68% increase over the year before. It supports proxy groups that have killed Americans, Israelis, and thousands of civilians across the region. It is not a good actor. It is not a sympathetic actor. It is, however, a rational one in the cold, unsentimental sense that it consistently pursues its interests with the tools available to it. The question the blockade raises is not whether Iran is bad. That question was settled decades ago. The question is, does doing this work? Does maximum pressure produce the outcomes it claims to produce? The historical record says no, or at least not in the way promised, on the timeline promised, with the collateral costs promised. Every sanction regime the United States has imposed on Iran since 1979 has been accompanied by the assertion that this time the pressure is maximum, the commitment is total, and Iran will have no choice but to comply. The Iranian nuclear program in 1979 did not exist. In 2026, Iran is sitting on uranium enriched to near weapons grade, and the United States is running a naval blockade in international waters, while allied nations organize a separate navigation mission and China ignores the whole thing. The blockade also exposes something about the structure of American foreign policy that both parties prefer not to discuss. The executive branch has accumulated over decades the functional authority to launch wars, impose blockades, and deploy military force globally with no meaningful legislative check. No formal declaration and no defined endpoint. Trump did not ask Congress for authority to blockade Iran. He announced it on Truth Social. The ceasefire extension was not a treaty, it was a post. This is not unique to Trump. Obama bombed 7 countries. George W. Bush launched 2 wars on authorizations that lasted 20 years. Clinton bombed Serbia. The bipartisan consensus on presidential war power has been consistent. It belongs to the president exercises it, and Congress mostly watches. The difference is that this president announces it in all caps, which makes it more visible. Whether visible and accountable are the same thing is the question nobody in Washington seems eager to test. Here is what we know. The United States is running a naval blockade against a country it is technically in a ceasefire with, having launched a war it did not formally declare, using a communication infrastructure that consists partly of a social media platform owned by a different billionaire, in pursuit of a nuclear deal that replaced the nuclear deal that America withdrew from, because that deal wasn't good enough. Iran, meanwhile, is seizing commercial ships with speedboats, charging $2 million tolls to pass through waters it doesn't legally own. In response to a blockade it calls an act of war, while simultaneously saying it wants to negotiate, while simultaneously closing the strait it had just reopened, while simultaneously executing citizens at a rate that would shock most people if the strait weren't monopolizing the news. China is buying Iranian oil, the UK is doing minesweeping, France is holding a conference, 26 ships have already bypassed the blockade. Brent crude is at $100. Oil prices dropped 11% the morning Iran said the strait was open, then rose again the afternoon Iran closed it back. Global energy markets are now governed by the mood of 2 governments that can't agree on a meeting location. The White House press secretary says the president is happy. Treasury says Karg Island storage tanks will be full in days. Truth Social says the ships will be eliminated. And somewhere in all of this, in the machinery of maximum pressure and counter-blockade and ceasefire extension and world extortion and finely tuned naval operations and 2 one-hour trips to Islamabad that end, without a deal somewhere in all of that is the actual question nobody is asking out loud, which is, what does this end with? Not what does it end? What does it end with? Because blockades don't float indefinitely. Ceasefires don't extend forever. A $100 barrel of oil has a political half-life. China's patience is not unlimited. Iran's oil wells, once shut in, take time to restart. The strait kept closed long enough stops being leverage and starts being the new normal, and new normals are very hard to reverse. What this ends with, historically, is either a deal that looks remarkably like the deals that came before it, negotiated under worse conditions and with higher costs already paid, or it doesn't end, it just continues, at a level of controlled catastrophe that everyone involved has learned to manage, price in, and call normal. Both of those outcomes have happened before. One of them produced the JCPOA, the other produced the last 47 years. The boats are still out there, the strait is still 21 miles wide, and somewhere on Truth Social, another post is being drafted.